it's Pentozali. It's the most popular war dance in Crete. When the dancers are staying online, they're ready for the fight, to start the begin the war, to attack. After they continue, and each one of them, the dancer, goes on the head of the dance line just because has to prove I'm ready to be the leader of the war, of the battle.
But you know, seeing the sky full of planes and paratroopers dropping, fully armed, you can't expect they come to visit. So they had to fight back and defend their land. It was only natural. It's only natural for us, at least.
After an historic invasion by air and 10 days of fierce fighting in May 1941, German forces were in effective control of the island of Crete. With the majority of Allied troops captured, evacuated, or literally escaping into the hills, in the last days of May 1941, with the Germans victorious, the remaining Allied troops had streamed south from the battle zones around Hania, heading to Sfakia and their evacuation point. Cretan irregulars had put up fierce resistance during the battle, and they continued this resistance as the occupation began to take hold.
So they used sticks, rocks, tools from the fields, whatever they had, and they fought.
This would lead to brutal and bloody reprisals.
There were significant massacres of civilians. There was a very unpleasant partisan war on both sides. And it's left a deep scar in a way that only a country that's been occupied and brutalized can possibly understand. And we have to understand what it's like to be under enemy occupation by a regime that has no compunction in slaughtering large numbers of civilians, many of whom will be innocent.
The Germans had a bad reputation for not taking prisoners. And there were certainly accounts of German paratroopers murdering civilians. You know, paratroopers are trained to be aggressive. They know that they're always going to jump into hostile territory. They know they're always going to be surrounded. And so these are aggressive young men in a desperate situation. So they are not the sort of soldiers you can rely on to take prisoners.
So when the German forces entered Crete, they of course were surprised first, then annoyed, then of course full of fear of those acts being committed against individual soldiers. And there were, would not deny this, terrible acts being committed on individual soldiers.
There were a lot of reprisals against the civilian population, especially the villages, which were in the Amari and so forth, which were focuses of resistance. The Germans got to know which ones they were, and they carried out these sweeps through the mountains with troops. But in most cases, the Andates, the guerrillas, got away before they arrived. But there were clashes, and then quite often they would kill many of the civilians in one of the villages involved.
It was very much a kind of action and reaction, serious, brutal, and in a way exceeding all what was necessary and probably being accepted.
German commander General Student would stand trial for war crimes for ordering German responses to Cretan resistance. The reprisals endorsed by the head of the Air Force, Göring, were numerous and alluded to in notices distributed by the Germans.
A lot of historians now believe that you can trace the military behavior of the German army or armies to civilians from pretty much 1870 through to the Second World War. Some of the brutality you get in the Second World War is this combination of an existing German military culture with Nazi ideology superimposed upon it, and the two in combination is really quite frightening.
In Condamari on June the 2nd, 1941, 22 men were shot by German paratroopers. Commanded by Lieutenant Horst Trebers, a former Hitler Youth member and the only officer of his battalion to survive the invasion unscathed. A German journalist who took these photos of the execution and helped a Cretan escape was court-martialed. Vasilis was 8 and witnessed the massacre.
Οι Γερμανοί κυκλώσαν το χωριό και μαζεύανε όσους βρίσκανε και στα χωράφια που εργαζότανε και τους συγκεντρώνανε εδώ, χωρίζοντας τους νέους από τα γυναικόπαιδα και τους γέρους. Στην επιλογή που κάνανε αργότερα είπανε ότι από 18 χρόνων μέχρι 50 ετών.
Vasilis' uncle was among those executed.
Την είδα, γιατί μετά που φύγανε οι Γερμανοί έτρεξαν οι συγγενείς των εκτελεσθέντων. Πολλοί μάλιστα μείνανε και το βράδυ εδώ μανάδες και αδερφές και σύζυγοι για το φόβο μήπως τα σκυλιά ή οι γάτες επιτεθούν στα διαλυμένα κυρίως κρανία.
Δεν τα πήρανε.
Όχι, δεν επιτρέψαν να τα φούνε. Την επομένη ήρθανε δυο με μια μοτοσυκλέτα και μετρήσανε τα πτώματα και αν θυμάμαι καλά τη δεύτερη μέρα πια είπαν να τα φούνε. Η θηριωδία των Ναζί ήταν τέτοια που παρά το διαλυμένο των εκτελεσθέντων επακολούθησε και η χαριστική βολή λεγόμενη.
Here in Kandanos on June the 3rd, the very next day, just 2 days after the surrender, villagers were punished for holding up German motorcycle divisions who were heading south along the mountain road to the village of Paliokra to stop the Allies landing reinforcements on the island's south coast. 25 German soldiers had been killed in the action. The villagers would pay dearly for their actions a few days later. Fearing retaliation, the villagers had taken refuge in the surrounding hills. The Germans entered the village and razed it to the ground.
On the day of the 3rd of June 1941, a special regiment came with a command from the city of Heraklion. They reached the village of Kandanos on 3rd of June. They would enter villages. There were some incidents of looting. They would place dynamite strategically in the walls of the houses. They would place white phosphorus to ignite them. They would place grenades inside people's villages, blow up and burn the village. Nothing was saved. Again, we have incidents of executing people on the spot. Anyone who was caught inside his village was executed on the spot and left to die. The entire village was blown up.
Την ίδια μέρα, πάλι όσους βρήκαν στους δρόμους, στα σπίτια τους εκτέλεσαν. Οι κάτοικοι που είχαν φύγει από την Κάντανο και στα βουνά.
As the regiment entered the village, gunshots were sounded. Expect more dead as you hear the gunshots from the mountains around us. And then they watched in horror as columns on fire and explosions razed the village to the ground. Up to 15 days later, people were able to see columns of fire and smoke coming out of the wreckage of the village, and that is because the entire southwest Crete is based on olive oil production.
Αυτή την εικόνα, τη θλιβερή εικόνα, να μένουν χωρίς σπίτια, συν τους νεκρούς που είχαν. Φέρανε οι Γερμανοί δύο...
Later the Germans came back. They found a door from a house and they took the blackboard of the school and they wrote on it, because you took up arms against us, because you murder our soldiers and not just let them pass by without harm, this village was razed to the ground, never to be rebuilt again.
Θέλησαν να μην υπάρχει Κάντανος.
Article 3 6/13 forbid the shooting of civilians without a military judge being present. Kurt Student ordered that officers could order execution, could decide on the spot how many to the men, women and children, how villages should be treated. Even the looting of villages was legitimate as a kind of repercussions to certain actions. But this is a clear violation of the army regulations, the German army regulations, but also, of course, of the conduct of war laid down in the Hague Convention of 1907.
The Cretans would pay dearly for protecting Allied soldiers who would be left behind after the evacuation. Several thousand had been taken prisoner, but hundreds took to the mountains in southern Crete, where they were protected for months, even years, by Cretan families. German authorities knew the Allied soldiers were on the run and issued leaflets demanding they surrender, or else. In the coming months, several individual groups of these escapees would make their way in small craft across the Mediterranean to Africa. One of the first was Australian Stan Carroll, who later demonstrated how he made the final leg of the journey with just a steel can to keep him afloat after spending several weeks on a solo escape trek on a small boat he found on the south coast. Finally reunited with his battalion in Egypt, he alerted the Allies about the number of stranded soldiers still on Crete.
Teach Carroll was able to tell them that there were dozens of others, potentially hundreds of others Australians who had got away and were hiding in the cliffs on the south coast of Crete. And it was Carroll's story that inspired the British to get their SOE teams in and re-establish communication, catch up with those survivors, and that led to the mass rescue of Australian and New Zealand and British evading troops on the south coast of Crete.
A number of other groups also made daring escapes. This group of Australians sailed to Egypt in a craft powered by sails made from army blankets stitched together with bootlaces. These soldiers, who manned the rearguard against advancing Germans but were left behind, also escaped by small boat and were picked up at sea. A group of New Zealanders seen here on the south coast commandeered this small craft to sail to Egypt too. Hundreds of other soldiers were protected by Cretan families or hid out in the hills and caves awaiting rescue. In Sfakia today, a memorial contains the remains of 26 Cretans executed for aiding Allied soldiers.
Αυτοί παραμείναμε. Ήταν λοιπόν δυο, ο Μανώλης και ο Γλιγόρης, και τροποδότουνα 2 χρόνια. Και τον πήγαινα στο κρυό τη νύχτα, ήθελα να μαγειρέψει η μάνα μου μια μουτιά, ό,τι είχαμε, να το πάρω το σακουλάκι και να πάω τη νύχτα τον πάω φαΐ.
Οι Νεοζηλανδοί, οι Εγγλέζοι και οι Κύπροι και Αυστραλοί πιάσανε το αμάρι. Λοιπόν, ήρχονταν στο άλλο μέρος πάρα πολύ και φιλοξενούντανε από τους χωριανούς. Σε κάθε σπίτι και στο σπίτι το δικό μας ήρθανε πάρα πολύ. Ψωμί δεν είχαμε να φάμε εμείς και το δίδανε στους ανθρώπους αυτούς. Και τους βοηθούσανε, τους
played a crucial role in getting the Allied soldiers off the island. The monasteries on this isolated south coast have been here for hundreds of years, and the area still has a timeless quality. Shepherds herd their goats on tiny roads and ancient bridges constructed by the monasteries still stand. Abbots from the Greek Orthodox Church have a tradition of protecting Greek independence, going back to the Turkish occupation and before. In the Second World War under Nazi occupation, it was no different. Hundreds of Allied troops were hidden and supported by the Preveli monasteries, hiding out in caves, in isolated gorges nearby, or in the monastery itself. They included Raymond Sandover and 130 of his men, Australian defenders of Rethmanon who'd not surrendered and taken to the hills instead. They'd be taken off by the submarine HMS Torbay in August 1941. When the last Allied soldiers escaped from here in 1943, the abbot had to go with them, as traitors had informed the Germans of his role. Today at Preveli, high above the Mediterranean, a memorial commemorates the role of the monastery and its priests who supported and protected the Allied soldiers. There were many daring escapes along the rugged south coast. Australian James Carstairs wrote a diary about life on the run, describing a tablespoon of water as his only nourishment. Others escaped from this remote gorge in western Crete in 1943. It's silent today, and a lone memorial in this isolated place alludes to the episode. Carstairs and 85 companions had been taken off by a British boat, the Hedgehog, in 1941. After their victory, the Germans had named the island Fortress Crete, and by 1943, there were 75,000 soldiers on the island. This constituted a sixth of the entire Cretan population. Crete became an important air staging post in the resupply of German forces in North Africa, where Rommel wreaked havoc until late 1942. Concerned about a British sea invasion, they embarked on an ambitious series of public works, including defences and the rebuilding of airstrips, to further fortify the island. And the Cretans were used as a labour force.
So there was a series of public works, naval bases, fortifications, airports, roads, bunkers, all that had to be constructed by the workforce of the local people. So, in fact, all Cretans from the age of 16 until the age of 50 were obliged to offer obligatory work in a regular basis. This age also sometimes fell into the age of 12.
The hated forced labour project involved half the Cretan male population at its peak, and resistance from the Cretans was met with a steady stream of reprisals. Villages were surrounded by barbed wire, labour camps established, collective punishments meted out. These were dark years for the Cretan population. With little or no money or supplies coming from their homeland, the Germans were forced to live off the Cretans.
A local German garrison could find, the village and tell them you have to bring us, 100 eggs or 3 pigs or whatever. And that was constant. So, the soldiers were fed off the ground in Crete. They had not, provisions of their own.
The Germans also took over and occupied iconic Cretan sites. They established their headquarters first in Hania, where they occupied the home of the Greek and Cretan statesman Venizelos. They also established their HQ here at the Hopa Hotel, still here today. Then later they set up their headquarters further east, at the Villa Ariadne, next to the historic Minoan site of Nassos. This was the former home built by Sir Arthur Evans, the eminent British archaeologist responsible for uncovering so much of the ancient Minoan city. Not all massacres or executions were of Cretans. John Pendlebury, Evans' protege, had taken over from his boss in the years preceding the war. But with the outbreak of war, he became a British agent.
John Pendlebury is still a myth in Crete. We call him the Lawrence of Crete. And many people talk about this ghost because he was like a ghost, even in the German ice. He was an archaeologist based in Villa Ariadne in Knossos, and he was the curator of Knossos as well. Parallel with this, he was a captain of the intelligence.
Working undercover and injured just a day after the invasion, he was discovered in civilian clothes, regarded as a partisan and executed by the Germans. This brilliant archaeologist was aged just 36.
The British was always the best, even now, intelligence net in the world, because there is an experience in this. Educated in Oxford, archaeologists and spies as well. And for the Cretan eyes, they were idols because they could speak the ancient Greek very well, and they knew the island from step to step, as we say. The British are more flexible. They can approach the mentality of other nations more easily. The Germans, as a mentality, and they insist to keep with them their personal and their German behavior, although they are in a foreign country.
The British intelligence network on Crete, part of the SOE, would become one of the most successful intelligence networks in occupied Europe, responsible for surveying of enemy positions and movements and planning sabotage operations. This booklet from the SOE gives an indication of the level of detail the intelligence services got into. Information gathered would help disrupt German aircraft movements. These intelligence operatives would be landed on remote south coast beaches with their supplies and radio sets. They would then dress as Cretans and included colourful characters such as Patrick Lee Fermor, who would undertake one of the most daring undercover operations of the war.
He was so brave in playing those games that he could walk in the German city of Heraklion, making jokes with Germans, pretending being a civilian and checking their uniforms and asking for cigarettes, and he could do these things and laughing and getting back to his wireless and give informations. He was a man not being afraid of anything. He penetrated the forced labor group, and he was working with them just in being able to approach the cannons, hit the barrel, and realize that they were wooden, painted, in order to confuse the RAF. So a few minutes later, he was walking on the mountains to the wireless, another personality, sending messages that the cannons in the airfield of south of Heraklion are fake. No.
As early as 1942, raids were undertaken against airfields which were critical to the resupply of German forces in North Africa. A bold one at Heraklion Airport destroyed more than 20 aircraft, but resulted in the execution of 50 prominent Cretans. During the occupation, the Germans had effectively divided the island into east and west. They ran the west themselves and put their Italian allies in charge of the most eastern zone.
The Italians in Crete arrived, as we say, as winners in 1941 with the Germans. This is the reality, because they lost the war with us in 1940. So they disembarked in the eastern part of the island. There was no battlefield, and let me tell you that they did film a fake attack. They did twice film a kind of disembarkation, including mules, donkeys, and them. That is a very funny thing that we discover now.
Some of the Italian troops really didn't see the need to fight the Greeks to that extent. The troops that were on the island were more of a burden than an actual help to the German war effort in the Mediterranean.
After Mussolini was overthrown in September 1943, the Italian commander on Crete, Angelico Carter, a royalist, not fascist, contacted Patrick Lee Fermor and arranged to be smuggled to Egypt along with the defense plans for the rest of the island. After abandoning his car near the divisional headquarters at Napoli as a diversion, Carter and his comrades were then guided southwest across the island by Fermor and Greek partisans. Evading German patrols and observation planes, he rendezvoused with a British motor torpedo boat near Tsatsuro reaching Marsa Matruh in Egypt the next afternoon. There had been more than 20,000 Italian troops stationed in eastern Crete. After the Italian armistice, most had surrendered. Hitler had instructed that they should be taken as POWs and sent to the Reich as military internees. The fate of many of these Italian POWs from Crete would become one of the great forgotten tragedies of the Eastern Mediterranean, incurring a loss of life greater than the Allies had endured in 1941. Just a month after the surrender, a German merchant ship, the Sintra, carrying 2,000 POWs, was sunk, and most POWs loaded in the hold below drowned. Then another merchant ship, the Petrella, carrying 3,000 POWs, suffered a similar fate, torpedoed and sunk by British submarine HMS Sportsman. 2,600 perished. Locals in Rethmanon remember hundreds of bodies washing up on beaches. In both these sinkings, the German guards were accused of locking the holds when the boat sunk. German reprisals would worsen in 1944 with the return of General Friedrich Müller as commander. He was already known as the Butcher of Crete. Müller was to be the target of the most daring operation carried out by British intelligence led by Fermor, but he'd just been replaced by another commander, General Crete.
In the Second World War, General Crete, I think, was the only German commander, certainly of the rank of general, who was ever kidnapped by a small group of commandos and resistance men.
Over a period of several months, Fermor and his fellow agent, William Moss, had assembled the kidnap party involving several Greek partisans. Fermor had been parachuted into the island earlier in the year, and the party set off from high in the mountains of Crete. They'd already staked out a kidnap spot at a road junction shown on this hand-drawn map by Moss. For the abduction, Fermor and Moss had dressed up as German army corporals. In April 1944, Crete was heading down this road with just a driver and no escort. It was a much narrower road than now. A memorial here at the kidnap point described what happened next as Fermor and Moss, dressed in their German uniforms and manning a fake checkpoint, stopped the car.
The moment the car slowed down, we dressed up as German corporals. I went to the left-hand door. I didn't see the general once. I saw who he was by his medals and asked him for his papers. And he said, "I'm General Crete." And I caught hold of him, pulled him out, and the other boys immediately took care of him, tied him up, and put him in the back of the car.
They forced me into the car, and with a German gun pointing my head, we drove to Heraklion. Later on, we stopped, and they took me out of the car again. Fermor came out with me.
And all the other boys, Savioulakis, Patirakis, Tirakis, jumped in, and off we went. And we only did it just in the nick of time, because it took just about a minute, and the moment we moved off, a whole stream of German cars, German troop-carrying cars full of German soldiers passed by, so we did it just in the nick of time.
The general's car, the general, and the kidnappers continued the journey back to Heraklion, where they were to pass through more than 20 checkpoints, even including the gates of the old city. The car continued on, was abandoned by Moss and Fermor, although they took the car's pennants, now in the Rethmanon Folklore Museum. Crete was then spirited away in an arduous 3-week trek across the island. The party would hide out along the way before reaching the coast near Rodokino, where Crete was picked up by boat and taken to Egypt, where he would begin his captivity for the rest of the war. The British then produced leaflets in German bragging that they'd just kidnapped their commanding officer. In 1972, the participants of this real-life escape drama, including Fermor and an ailing General Crete, were reunited on Greek television in a bizarre This Is Your Life encounter. Fermor and Crete recounted the experience.
No matter who wins, there is nothing...
The point of the operation was to inflict a tremendous insult against the German prestige in Crete. Because the Germans have been tormenting Crete for the last 2 years. They've been killing and burning villages, and the most appalling tyranny prevailed in Crete. And to destroy their morale and to bolster our own and show that at least we could do something.
Wenn ich danach gefragt werde, muss ich sagen, es war eine sehr...
If you ask me, I must admit that my abduction was a very daring operation, a brave and risky act. But I don't think that it was practical. It didn't help the partisans at all.
When we set off with the general finally in the mountains, after Anoia, we went right up onto the top of Mount Ida, and we went through terrible hardships, because the whole of the German garrison, or the whole of Crete, was out all round Mount Ida, all round Heraklion, everywhere, thousands of them. And so what we had to do was to hide in caves by day and move very, very carefully at night. We went from village to village, hiding outside the villages. By the time we reached the coast, hundreds of Cretans knew exactly where we were, but not one of them betrayed us.
It had a tremendous effect and fillip to the population. I remember Manoussas Manousakis, who was very much involved on the peripheries of it, saying he said the whole island felt several inches taller as a result of this success.
The successful kidnapping of Crete sparked further German reprisals later in 1944. The vast Amari Valley had been a favoured thoroughfare for escapees and the resistance, and the Crete party had passed through here. Here, 9 villages were destroyed and 164 killed. This monument at Anomeris commemorates what happened here. Father Papa lost his father here.
Σε διάδρομο και τους πήγανε και τους βάλανε στο γραφείο του σχολείου, τους 30. Απ' έξω δε επιροβολούσανε και σπάσανε τα τζάμια του σχολείου, δεξιά-αριστερά. Πυροβολούσαν τα ζώα. Ό,τι ζώα βρίχνανε στον δρόμο, αγελάδες, γαϊδούρια, εγωπρόβατα, χείρους, ό,τι ήθελα να τους τύχει στον δρόμο, τους πυροβολούσαν και τα σκοτώνανε τα ζώα. Από τους άνδρες και τις νέες γυναίκες απ' έξω. Και τις έσανε έξω από το σχολείο σε γραμμή. Και κατόπιν αρχίσαν και πυροβολούσαν και χτυπούσαν τα τζάμια και πέφτανε κάτω πέρα από τις πόδες και απάνω από τα κεφάλια των πυροβολισμοί και πώς τους αρχίσαν και τους απομακρύνανε από το σχολείο. Εμένα με διώξανε βέβαια από εκεί, με απείλησαν ότι θα με σκοτώσει ο εξωτερικός φρουρός και έφυγα και πήγα και τα είπα στη μητέρα μου και έκλαιγε συνεχώς. Και πήγαμε στο μέρο. Είδαμε χαλασμένο όλο το χωριό ερειπωμένο, την εκκλησία ερειπωμένη, τις εικόνες πεταμένες, τα πάντα είχαν ερημώσει. Το σπίτι μας είχε μία αυλή και ήτονε περίπου 30 με 40 πόντους, προβιές από ζώα και φτερά από κότες και είχαν σφάξει ζώα και είχαν πέτρες βάλει. Αντί για πλήθους δεν ήταν τότε.
Southwestern Crete, with its dramatic and impenetrable coastline, rugged mountains, cliffs and gorges, was home to numerous groups of resistance fighters. Tiny villages like Kustageriko were targeted by the Germans. It was home to Manolis Paterakis, the most trusted Cretan colleague of Paddy Fermor. His son Yanis and nephew are still here today.
Everybody in Kustageriko had a weapon and was against the Germans. And of course, the action of Manolis, Patero Manolis, Patero Vasilis was known Germans. And for this reason, for example, Germans asked, where is Manolis? Where is Vasilis? Because they knew about both Vasilis and Manolis.
The Germans were determined to track down the partisan fighters in the mountains around Kustageriko and sent mountain troops into the rugged landscape. But when the Germans arrived, the fighters would disappear into the mountains above.
Germans concentrated women and kids this square, small square, named Lakos. They had a plan to kill both women and kids. Adartes shoot from Perichila, shoot from a distance about 500 meters, and killed the chief with a machine gun of Germans. And then Germans went out, and the next day returned and destroyed the village. But Koustoyarako was empty because everybody was in Madara. And of course it's very easy to reconstruct a house, but not a human life.
The village was rebuilt afterwards, but during the occupation it was declared a dead zone.
Τίποτα. Nothing.
Nothing. All houses were destroyed, but the village was empty.
The most famous resistance group operating in these mountains was known as the Salino Gang. A leading member was Manolis's brother, Yannis's uncle, Vasilis Paterakis. The gang would be joined by a New Zealand sergeant, Dudley Perkins.
Για τον Πέρκινς τα καλύτερα λέγανε για τον Πέρκινς. Ήτανε παλικάρι καταρχάς και τον είχαν σαν αδερφό. Του είχαν πάρα πολύ εμπιστοσύνη και πήγαινε πρώτος πάντοτε στη μάχη. Πάντοτε έπαιρνε πρώτος ο Πέρκινς.
Very brave, very clever, very reliable, but unfortunately he was unlucky.
The gang was eventually tracked down by German counteragents, and Perkins was killed here in a firefight in 1944. Perkins is buried in Suda Bay Cemetery. As late as 1944, reprisals were still taking place in Western Crete. Here in the village of Mornius, 61 were executed. Zacharina's family was among the victims.
It was quite early in the morning. The whole village was asleep. They could not predict that they were coming. That's why the Germans moved very quickly and quietly and took over the neighborhoods of the village. The Germans looting, beating them, torturing them, shouting at them, demanding to know the answers they wanted. They didn't get them, took them in the afternoon and shot them. They were taken to a little gorge near the village. They were put in a row after they were made to dig their own graves. And at 6, they gave the order, and there was the shooting of the person standing there. Because the villagers would not inform them where the British guard was, what was the equipment they had, what were the plans. They knew. They didn't answer. So that was the cause for the execution of all the persons of the village. You cannot explain, there's not a logic in that. There's not a logic in that. You don't kill the 61 persons. You don't kill 61 persons because you don't get the answers that you want. My father-in-law was killed. 2 of his brothers, their father, and the father of my mother-in-law who came visiting. So there were 5 people from the same family killed in the execution. 20, 34, 13, age 13 was shot, 35 and so on, 20. So you can see all the male persons of the village were shot, and the village was left only with women and children. They didn't have any other equipment to do it. So they took the doors off the houses and got them to the gorge so they could carry the bodies, dead bodies, of course, in the village to be buried.
There was one survivor of the massacre who lived to tell the story, and he became the village priest as a result.
He was laying in the middle of the row of the dead. So the first German came, saw him in blood, and he thought he's already dead. So he didn't shoot him in the head. But he wanted his ring. As he said, I remember his words saying, I used to bite the dirt in order not to be discovered that I was alive. One of the bullets could not come out of his body. So he lived ever after with a bullet in his body until the end of his life.
The priest's son still holds the bullet that his father carried inside him for the rest of his life.
Every year at the commemoration event in the end of August, he would conduct the Mass in the church, saying all the names of the dead people, of the 61 persons, by heart. And I asked him, Father, will you tell me, how do you remember all these names, 61 names? How do you remember? And he said, in my mind, I go to each house, I knock the door, and I see the man coming out. That's why I remember.
All the families here have a story to tell, including 93-year-old George, whose father was taken.
Σκοτώσανε, λένε από την οικογένεια μας, 11 καστόνιδες. Τον πατέρα μου, τον αδερφό του, το γιο του, του μπάρμπα μου, του Μιχαλάκη, το όλο 11 καστόνιδες και οι υπόλοιποι χωριανοί.
George hid under a wine barrel when German troops arrived and took his father.
Συνέχεια ήρθε.
The Germans would return to the house several times to help themselves to the wine here.
Την ώρα που ήρθαν οι Γερμανοί, εγώ ήμουν κρυμμένος στο βαρέλι και ήμουν.
When they came, George would again hide behind the wine barrels, hoping not to be discovered.
Η καρδιά μου νόμιζα το χτύπω στην καρδιά μου πως θα τον ακούσουνε. Πήγανε με δούνε, επί τόπα με σκοτώνανε.
It's inexplicable. I mean, the war was already over in Europe, of course. They knew they'd lost. Yet they proceeded to do the execution because they didn't get the answers they wanted. That made the Germans more ferocious, more furious. So they paid them by taking their lives.
By the end of 1944, German morale was dissipating and desertions were becoming a problem. As it became clear the Germans would withdraw, British agents met at the Arkadi Monastery and near the ancient site of Nasos to plan the transition. As World War II entered its final phase and with German defeat looming, the Germans pulled back. In the end, the Germans remained in control of only a small pocket around Hanya and Suda Bay. Crete was among the last German possessions to surrender at the end of the war. Fearful of surrendering to Cretan militias, the German commander was secretly flown to meet the British here at the Villa Ariadne, their former headquarters at Knossos, and signed this unconditional surrender document on May the 9th, 1945.
Villa Ariadne was a symbol for the British Empire because it was the Evans residence, Pendlebury's residence, and of course the Secret Service base, let's say. So maybe the Minoan, as we say in Latin, pax, the Minoan peace, okay? So he had to sign there the final surrender document.
Fearful of revenge from Cretans, the British established a perimeter and arranged to escort the Germans off the island.
The problem about taking the surrender of the German troops on Crete was basically how to protect them from the Cretans. They couldn't suddenly say, right, well, drop your weapons and you're now our prisoners, because they wouldn't have been able to save them. So they allowed them to keep their weapons to begin with and waited until a battalion, I think, of the Royal Hampshires arrived and was able to basically form a perimeter and then march them to the ships to take them into captivity. But the idea, the Germans were terrified of being handed over to the Cretan resistance because they knew that revenge could be pretty nasty, to say the least.
The Cretans' fierce defence of their island led it to being regarded as one of the most successful resistance movements of the war. Patrick Lee Fermor, the most famous British SOE agent on Crete, became an acclaimed travel writer and only died in 2011, aged 96. Today, memorials to Cretans, German and Allied soldiers who lost their lives in this conflict can be found all over the island. Cretan bitterness at their treatment by the Germans lingered for decades after the war. Two generals who were commanders of the German forces during the occupation, Generals Brouwer and Müller, the so-called Butcher of Crete, were handed over by the British, tried by a Greek military court for war crimes and executed by a firing squad on May the 20th, 1947, the 6th anniversary of the invasion. Brouwer is buried in the German military cemetery here, but it took decades for him and others to be laid to rest. Greek claims for war reparations dragged on for years, with the dispute preventing the remains of German soldiers killed in the Battle of Crete being interred in a permanent cemetery on Cretan soil. After being removed from their original burial place, they were stored in a monastery for almost 30 years while negotiations continued.
The whole question of the German dead from the battle was one of, shall we say, complexity, because they had prepared their own graveyards, especially the paratroopers had, and held them there. And then, of course, when it came to the surrender, they had no further control, and the British troops weren't going to leave guards necessarily on the cemeteries. I don't think there were any of those cemeteries were necessarily defaced or anything like that. There weren't any of the bodies dug up. But it wasn't until, really, the 1970s that the Germans were in a position, A, to purchase the land above Malmö, where they were going to have, on Hill 107, where they were going to have the cemetery, but also to prepare it. And, of course, it required a huge amount of work, identifying the bodies so that they could all be properly reburied and identified. And, of course, many of them never were identified. And in that cemetery, you can see, you know, an unknown German soldier inscribed on many of the graves.
It wasn't until 1974 that this military cemetery, containing the remains of more than 4,300 German soldiers, was established here on Hill 107, overlooking the Malmö airfield, the site of their crucial victory, but also where so many paratroopers lost their lives. Even today, Cretan claims for compensation from the German government drag on, a symbolic reminder of one of World War II's most bitter conflicts.
It's a big issue. It's a big issue. It's not closed. I think the Greek parliament some days ago also took a decision that the question is open.
It's a view shared by survivors too. And politicians also make demands, even at commemorative ceremonies.
Germany should pay for the Holocaust in this Domo, for the crimes committed in this Domo. This is an irrevocable decision which Germany refuses to honor. There is no peace without justice, and justice has not been done for the Greek people, for the victims of the Nazi crimes. Thank you.
Today, the Battle of Crete is seared into the landscape and consciousness of Crete, a land that has endured 700 years of occupation in the last millennium. The commemorations even reenact a paratroop drop.
There can be no doubt that the Battle of Crete is completely unique because it was this airborne invasion, the first major airborne operation in history. I think the other ones one could describe more as raids. The other thing is, of course, that it was the biggest island captured ever, and to be captured basically by an airborne attack made the British and Americans think again. The great irony was that the Americans and the British decided to bolster their airborne forces, to develop them and to actually invest huge amounts into it until it got to the point of 1944, August, of actually having an Allied airborne army. The Germans, on the other hand, took totally different lessons from the Battle of Crete and decided that never again would they use paratroops in large-scale operations. So here we see a complete parting of the ways and both going in opposite directions.
For Germans, it's uncomfortable, but sooner or later, they'll come to terms with what happened here, their own blood lost, the atrocities, and move on. This occupation lasted just 4 years, but for the people who witnessed this conflict, it's been a lifetime remembering.
As far as the futility of war, what do we get out of it? What's it matter? What are we gaining from it?
Like many, many times, I just ask the question, why? Yeah, why? And it still goes on today, doesn't it? All over the world. Why?